Hey, what's up? It's me again. Hope you're doing well. And in this video, we're gonna make this cool little truck mech guy. I'll go over the design process in Modeler and talk about what I'm thinking about when I concept a cool mech. So just sit back, grab a little drink or snack, and enjoy the video. I got the idea of making this mech after watching a video with my boy Peter Barakan on Japanology Plus about Keitrucks. Super interesting video, I'll share the link in the description. But basically they are small Japanese trucks and they look pretty cool, so I thought I'd turn one into a mech. Before I started sculpting, I gathered a bunch of reference images that you can see on my second monitor. I tried to keep it pretty concise, with only 4 images per subject. Jumping into Modeler, I knew I wanted a mech with some type of wheels on it. And I also knew that I wanted the cabin of the truck to be the main focus of the design. So I started by blocking that out first, marking down as many parts as I can as fast as possible, even if they're not the right shape. I just want something there that I'm able to move and modify. I then move on the second most important aspect of the design, and that would be the legs. I try to block them but be very gestural in the way I place them. And I make sure really early in the design that it sits flat on the floor and that it feels very stable. And I take the shape of the back of the truck and I rotate it 90 degrees to make it more fun and interesting, I guess. I want the design to be quite playful. I kind of have this image in mind of combining these two things together. I then try to refine the proportions of the cabin. And I look at my ref and see that one of the trucks has a cool Fast and Furious, body kit bumper on it, so I block that in and then block out some side view mirrors. The face of the truck is gonna be a super important feature, and it's where most of the personality of the design is gonna be the most obvious. So I try to commit early to a certain face and make sure I'm somewhat happy with it before I move on to other parts. The next thing I want to focus on is the stance. I want it to feel really solid and planted on the floor. So I move the legs around and trying to figure out how I want to position them and how they anchor back to the main body of the vehicle. I'm not too worried about the real joint placement to get a more dynamic stance or pose. I would rather place the joints around the parts than the other way around. I then indicate the placement of the wheels. I know I'm gonna spend more time later on to refine them and make it cooler, but I just want a general idea of the size and how it would sit on the floor. We're still really early in the design, so I'm not bothered at all about any type of symmetry or being clean. Then I move on to blocking some secondary shapes, some more intricate details, but without being too specific or getting super tight with the bolts and stuff. The design's gonna get more and more refined as we go, but if you start with something very clean right away, it's too slow and you lose kind of your energy, and your final design might end up looking very stiff or rigid. Not that being rigid for a mech is a bad thing, but I don't want my design to feel too serious. For example, if I were to design this whole thing in a CAD software from scratch with no sketch, it would look drastically different. I block in some eyebrows, windshield wipers, and some more details around the face. Here I start to realize I have a lot of different parts and that I'm gonna need to differentiate them soon and start assigning colors. So I create a bunch of different materials and I start assigning them to stuff. The first obvious one is a dark color for the tires, and then an accent color for the lights. I also know I want to contrast metallic shiny materials with more matte materials, so I add one of those in. I then isolate the cabin, and when I look at it, I find it too high, so I try to bring the roof down and make it more squat and compact, so I get less of an elongated face. Indicate some details like the door handles and make stuff a little bit straighter so that kind of looks like a door hinge, and experiment with some kind of reinforcement bar or something. Proportions are looking better, so I'm gonna put it back on the rest of the body. See how it would look and then readjust as I see fit. Adding a bit of overhang over the main windshield and then the side door. And here I look at my ref and I see that most of these trucks have round headlights, so I try to play with that and see how it would look, but I end up finding it looking a bit goofy, and I prefer the more rectangular shape language we have all over. I warp the side of the headlight so that it follows the contour of the cabin. And I then add some type of eyelid just to get a clean cut around my light shape so that it looks really sharp. Plus we're introducing another part so that it looks even more complex and we attract more attention to the face of our character or vehicle or whatever you want. And I still try to make those light happen, the round ones, but it ended up being too distracting. Like it was too much of a focus, that round shape, and I didn't really like it, so I ended up scrapping it. Then I start to isolate certain parts and make a clearer distinction in between the windows and the door handles, the bumper, stuff like that. I work very loose, but once I'm happy with a shape, I'll then pull it out on the side and then start refining it. I can clean up some of the edges, make sure that the position of our window is cool, and then boolean a cut into it, have another piece, and then start splitting a door handle from the door, carving into it, and giving it a different material, and then placing it back into the original position. Then I arrange stuff back around it and kind of indicate some door hinge. Make sure the shape of the door is cool. And here I look at my design and I'm trying to incorporate some type of round element because almost all of it is square except the wheels. And I want to kind of echo something round on the main body of the truck. Plus it kind of looks funny that way with the little hat. And then from my ref board, I knew I wanted to incorporate some type of Mech Warrior missile launcher pod. So I duplicate a bunch of cylinders around and I block out where I would want the holes to be. And then I boolean split everything and bada bing bada boom, you got a cool missile launcher. I then add one of the missiles back and I contemplate the idea of detailing the missile and everything, but I remind myself that I haven't figured out a bunch of other parts in the design, and then I need to fix those first before I can get into the nitty-gritty, let's detail a small element on the back of the truck. I boolean split a part of the leg and then I assign a different color so that I can see, you know, the internals and then the outer shell thing. I start making more distinction between my different gray materials. So I have some rough ones, some shiny ones, some lighter ones, and some darker ones. It introduces more variety and interest to the design, and you notice more that the different parts are separate. Fixing the little radar dish hat placement, and start to work on the back bumper. I want to make it feel heavy and like low to the ground, kind of have that feel, and try to see how it would look on the front as well. Moving stuff around and trying different things, see how it looks. It's a very flexible workflow and you can quickly judge if things look good or not. I finally find a placement and detail I like, and I realize that most of my design is very gray, and I want to try to see how it would look with a bit more color. And it makes me realize that I need even more separation in between my gray areas. So I use a new layer, I block out a quick mask, and then I boolean it with the mill leg. If you want more info on how to do all this splitting stuff, I have another video that covers it more in depth. Feel free to check that out. But I end up with this kind of off-white color that I'm pretty happy with, and I split every leg so that it has a dark gray and then this lighter color. I know that every part, the main portion of it is going to be light, and then the details, like these little mud flaps, are going to be dark. I keep assigning more colors on the model to separate the different parts. Then taking a quick look at the overall mech, trying to judge what part should I be addressing next. I choose to add some of that darker gray underneath. I then start to add a trim around my windshield just to make the separation in between the two elements sharper and crisper. Then the next phase is just to indicate some details. Just basically taking a mental note of where the details would go. We're adding complexity, but it's still not a super detailed phase. Adding stuff like hinges, some holes and bolts. I'm trying to break up the big flat surfaces or like very long uninterrupted lines. Same with the joints. I'm indicating the joint. It's still cleaner than our original sketch, but it's not super polished just yet. As we integrate more detail, I want to focus on the tires, which is like an important part of our design. With all the repeating threads, it's going to get pretty high frequency detail, and I'll kind of use this as a benchmark for the size of the detail all over our piece. I don't know if making just a tire requires its own tutorial video, but basically what I'm doing is I'm using the radial symmetry to clone one part all the way around our tire. I then mirror the whole thing on the other side of the tire and slightly offset it so that it's not perfectly symmetrical. And for the center of the tire, I do the same thing, but this time I do want a symmetrical piece. And if you want, you can get really precise with all that stuff, making sure all your layers are properly aligned and nestled and grouped together, and that your pattern is super tight. But to be honest, I kind of don't want to. It doesn't matter that much if your stuff is slightly misaligned. I know it'll hurt in the beginning. Like, your brain will be, oh, it's 2 pixels off. I won't be able to sleep. Like, if I show you the final image right now, you really don't notice that the pattern is not centered around the center of the tire. I eyeball it as best as I can, It looks good enough and your brain actually accepts it. And again, if you do want everything to be perfectly aligned, go for it. You'll know that it's aligned, and if it makes you happy, well, good on you. But, you know, let's normalize stuff being slightly off-center. Let's embrace imperfection in our model. It's what brings it more personality. Here I detail the rim of the tire, but I quickly noticed that we're not gonna see any of it because it's gonna be hidden behind the leg armor. So I make it nice-ish just for my own sanity, but I'm not too bothered if it's not perfect. And since the tire I'm working on that's isolated here is an instance, all the modifications I do on it gets repeated to the 6 other tires. Next, I'm gonna start cleaning up the legs, so I isolate them. I use the mirror repetition to figure out the proper center of the piece, and then I merge it back onto itself so that it's symmetrical. I up-res the piece so I have more voxels to work with, and I can get cleaner, sharper details. And I start cleaning up and detailing my part. There's a whole video of me explaining how I go over detailing and cleaning up just one part. The process is pretty straightforward. I just work on a slightly higher resolution. I make sure my shapes are nice and clean. I'm also not trying to model exactly what the piece look like. I'm just trying to make a piece that looks good. So if there's a certain shape that's not working for me, or that it's really hard to make, I might change the design so that it's more adapted to the rest of the piece. I try to make sure that there's enough clearance between the tire and the part, and having that part isolated on the side allows me to work on it from every angle, and going back and forth from my sculpt to the isolated piece, I can work on it in and out of context. When detailing a piece, if there's a part that you don't like, you can either erase from it or you can add on top of it. By adding or removing more clay, you kind of clean up the edges. And when doing the whole detailing process, the main idea is just to remove stuff that you don't like and add stuff that you like. So while I work, I'm constantly rotating my sculpt to judge what areas I want to edit. And in this case, while looking at my sculpt, I decide that I need to clean up the headlights, which are basically the eyes of my character, to make sure that area of detail is clearly defined. I look at my ref and I notice that I need to encase the glass of the light inside some kind of metal frame. So I use my split tool to make a nice clean cut for the light shape. The casing around the light can still be pretty messy, but it'll look cleaner overall because of the split cut is so sharp. I play with the kind of eyelid flaps to see if I can give it a different expression. I end up deciding to have a subtle expression instead of something very on the nose. If I decide to change the expression later on, it would be pretty easy since all these parts are separate. I then move on to the back of the truck, adding some like turn signals and brake lights. I look at my sculpt and I decide it's time to detail the rest of the legs. I recently got a new camera to record more video, so let me know if you like seeing that perspective. I wasn't able to record for a very long period, but now that I have a better understanding of my camera and a bigger SD card, I'll experiment with different views and showing you guys different angle of the process. I keep detailing the legs by isolating the piece in the center of the scene and having an instanced copy on the sculpt itself. It's the exact same way I approach the front leg. I'll do the same thing with the middle and back legs. I clean up some of the noise around the doors. I add a little step so that the driver is able to get in easier, and add some smaller details around the joints. I try to play around with a bar that goes in front of the tire, but in the end I end up removing it because it was a little bit too distracting. I isolate the middle leg and split it where the joint would be. And then to clean it up, same thing, I mirror the piece and then merge it back onto itself to get a symmetrical layer. Then you can clean up the edges, make decisions on what shapes you want to remove, what shapes you want to add. And if you have a hard time cleaning up and detailing stuff, make sure you have plenty of ref that you're able to look at and pull out elements you like. Try to replicate them on your own design. Here I make a link or an instance out of my piece and I put it back on the truck so that every operation I do on the isolated piece gets repeated. And then I place the joint around the part, since I want the position of my leg to be dictated by the tire and the front part, and not the joint itself. This is not a rule though, sometimes you do want the joint to dictate the length or the placement of certain elements. For example, if you're designing for a human character, there's certain hard points or joints that you're not able to move because it would deform the proportion of a normal human. It's just that for this specific project, since I sketched it and nailed down my poles with the main chunk of the leg, that's what dictates the rest of the design. And for the back leg, I turn symmetry on and off to be able to get more clearance so that the leg doesn't clip onto the main body of the truck. I add a little mud flap on the tire, and I then work on cleaning up the joint, upping the resolution of my layer and making sharper shapes with my brush. I still want my joints to be believable and seem to look like they function. If I had more time and I wanted something super tight, I could refine the clearance in between the parts and make sure everything connects. It has to look believable, but I don't want to spend so much time to make it perfectly engineered. I know it's going to be a static mesh in the end, so I just want things to be connected in an elegant way, but still be fast enough that I can crank out a sculpt like this in a couple of hours. For reference, this whole sculpt was made in about 4 sessions of 30 minutes, so 2 hours total. I could spend so much more time working on this and make it really polished, but that would also mean I would have to narrate this video for what seems like an eternity. So I'm just trying to achieve a good balance of detail all over the piece so that all of it is at a certain level of polish. I want the piece to look finished, even if it's not finished. The detail and cleaning up phase takes a very long time and it's pretty repetitive. Most of the design process happens in the very beginning of the project. So while it can be interesting to watch all of it, I really don't want to bore anybody by repeating the same thing over and over again. And while making these videos, I'm trying to develop my communication skills, if you want, because while I'm sculpting, I try to juggle all of these different principles and inspiration, making decisions on the fly, and being able to articulate why I'm doing it is pretty tricky. Most of it is internalized and it's art at the end of the day, right? It's not just a process. You have to feel it, and being able to translate that in words is hard for me. I invested all of my skill points into image making and not speech. The rest of the sculpt is pretty cozy. I just add little details here and there where I want more focus. These little notches and tick marks I'm adding are my favorite part. If they're placed correctly, they can really enhance the look of a certain shape. Also clean up the underside of the mech. I noticed that in my ref, one had a spare tire underneath, so I try to incorporate that into my design as well. I trim it down to make sure that it doesn't touch the floor, and I sketch in some kind of straps to attach the tire. Having 3 sets of legs with different sizes, it would need 3 different sizes of spare tires. So I add some more. And I make sure they're strapped in. This will also be cool once we 3D print the piece because it'll add a lot of physical weight to it. Plus, you'll be able to grab the mech in your hands, turn it around, and then see that it's well designed from every angle. I really want to create tactile objects that are fun to interact with, as well as interesting to look at. Even if it's just a silly mech toy, its purpose is still to be played with, right? So that's why I spend so much time making sure the pose and the stance is interesting and that it has a nice sense of weight. Since it's not going to be articulated and movable, I want to make sure that it looks right for anybody that displays it or just looks at the image. Playing with 3D printing recently has been a ton of fun, and it makes me think even more now about how my sculpts would look in real life, what kind of space they would occupy, and how they would feel being on someone's shelves or being painted. Here's a quick clip of the latest print that is available on the Patreon, and I just want to take a minute to thank everyone who's been showing their support and subscribing to the Patreon. For the moment, I don't plan to limit the amount of sculpts on the Patreon. I just want people to have a good library of stuff that they can print. And if you want to just subscribe for 1 month and then grab all the sculpts and cancel the subscription, no, that's just fine by me. As long as you're having fun printing and painting my silly little mechs, that's all that matters to me. The sculpting, the printing, and all the videos I'm making, I do it because I enjoy it. Back to the sculpt, I'm finally detailing our missile launcher. I want to have the same feel as the old school Mech Warrior that's on my ref board. It's among the first exposure to mech I had when I was a kid, and it's super iconic. And for the missile shape itself, I kind of want to make it look like a felt tip marker, just because it's another thing that resonates with me. I love pencils and markers and stuff like that. It's also another element that adds more playfulness to the design. Because yes, we could be super edgy and design something very pointy and aggressive, but it kind of goes against the mood of the piece. Because at the end of the day, it's still just a cute little truck guy, even if it carries an insane amount of firepower. Maybe it's for self-defense, you know? You can make your own backstory about this thing. And here is some classic useless detailing for stuff that people will never see. They'll be fully covered in the pod thing, but if we ever decide to pull one of the missiles out, well, at least you know it's done. Also, green was a pretty arbitrary color. I end up matching it to the other orange that's on the lights. This design will also benefit from a fun paint job. At the end, I add some simple markings on it, but it would be pretty interesting to do a version where it's all banged up and spray painted with graffiti and stickers. Or even if we go back to our ref and have some cool branding that you see on the tuned Japanese cars, you know, and make up some fake sponsors. It kind of adds to the storytelling of the piece. I add some sort of LED bar. I think it works better than the previous version that we had that was very round. These lights are in reality super complex and made out of a million different parts, but I'm abstracting most of it to just a simple shape. The same way a painter who makes a landscape wouldn't paint every single blade of grass. We're simplifying things and taking artistic liberties about where we want our detail to be and where do we want to remove it to not distract the viewer with unnecessary information. We're approaching the end of the sculpt here. I try to focus more on the design aspect rather than the tools and the techniques that I was using. So let me know if you had any questions or comments, if there's something that you would like to see covered in the next video. We'll have this truck model available soon for 3D printing. Keep an eye out on the Patreon and the socials. I'll post about it whenever it's ready. This piece was super fun to make. I really got inspired by those tiny Japanese trucks. I even got a plastic model kit of one of them before starting the project. I still have yet to finish it, but they should look really cool side by side once they're both done. Some final details left and right, and we're pretty much done with the sculpt. Hope you had a good time watching this, felt inspired to start sculpting your own project in VR. Tag me online if you decide to share some of your work. I always love to see what you guys come up with. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments. I always try my best to help out when I can. And keep an eye out on the Patreon for some new 3D print releases. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.